Afternoon and good evening. We'd like to welcome you tonight as the World Affairs Council continues to celebrate its 50th year anniversary with our program this evening with the 26th Secretary of Defense, 4-Star General Jim Mattis. We'd like to appreciate and recognize our elected officials, our members of the Consular Corps, and our Board of Directors of the World Affairs Council. Thank you all for coming. I want to remind you of some upcoming programs that we have. We have a fantastic luncheon coming up in October with Robert Kaplan, the President of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. We also continue our Young Professional and Early Careers program, so make sure you get on our website and check out what's happening in October for our young professionals. Lastly, we have former Press Secretary Sean Spicer also on our agenda. All of these can be found on our website, and I hope you saw the calendars on your chair when you came in. Lastly, we have U.S. National Security Advisor Ambassador Susan Rice also joining us in November. So again, take advantage of all of our programs. We love having all of you here this evening, and I hope you have a fantastic evening with us. We do want to thank our sponsors for the evening. Please join me in thanking our presenting sponsor, Wells Fargo. Also our lead sponsor, BP. And as always, our friends here at the Ballroom Place and Houston Public Media. I'm just curious, how many of you in the audience are veterans this evening? Thank you all for all you've done for our country. We really appreciate you. Now it's my privilege to call to the podium from Combined Arms, John Borsler.
Howdy. Well, thank you so much for having us, Marianne. And sir, it's an honor to meet you again. Thank you so much for being in wonderful Houston, Texas, the greatest city in the world for military and veterans on the planet. If you guys don't know much about Combined Arms, just check us out, combinedarms.us, and we're here for you, all the veterans and the veteran family members. Thank you so much for your continued support. And Marianne, from our unit to yours, it's a military tradition to give a challenge coin, and I want to say thank you so much for hosting us tonight. Thank you so much. Semper Fi, sir.
Also, please join me in welcoming from the Lone Survivor Foundation, Spike Garcia.
Thank you, Marianne. Thank you, General. Welcome, and I want to say the Lone Survivor Foundation was started back in 2010 to help our combat veterans and those who are still in uniform, who are suffering from PTSD, mild traumatic brain injury, chronic pain, and military sexual trauma. We provide these services for free through our 1-week post-traumatic growth program. Regardless of where they're in the country, bring them as a couple and as a family unit, all at no cost. Our goal is to help them to move from surviving to thriving. Thank you for what you do. Thank you for supporting the Lone Survivor Foundation. We appreciate being here. And for those who continue to give back to your community and to our country, thank you.
Let's give another round of applause for both these fantastic organizations. Now, once again, please join me in welcoming Mr. Ashley North from Wells Fargo, who will introduce our speaker for this evening.
Thank you, Marianne. It's a pleasure to be with you all tonight. It's not often that one is tasked with introducing a legendary leader like General James Mattis. But before we get into introductions, I'd like to say thank you to the World Affairs Council for making tonight possible. It's an honor to have global leaders like General Mattis visit Houston to share their experiences and perspectives from abroad. That's one of the many reasons why Wells Fargo is proud to support the World Affairs Council and the vital role it plays in bringing global issues to the forefront so that we as citizens are better informed about the world that surrounds us. Organizations like World Affairs Council serve as a catalyst for bridging the gap between international affairs and what's happening right here in Houston. As a bank that's based in the community, we want to be part of those larger conversations that help Houston thrive. As we talk about global issues, it's imperative that we utilize partnerships between the business community to leverage talent and resources to build a stronger economy in Houston. We applaud the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston's work to bring to light those issues abroad that are impacting us locally. Together, we can further the conversation to strengthen our social and economic footprints. I can tell you, it's an honor. I can't tell you what an honor it is to introduce our guest speaker, James Mattis, the 26th Secretary of Defense. As a retired Sergeant First Class in the United States Army, sir, thank you for your service. During his more than four decades in uniform, Secretary Mattis commanded Marines at all levels, from an infantry rifle platoon to a Marine expeditionary force. He led an infantry battalion in Iraq in 1991, an expeditionary brigade in Afghanistan after the 9/11 terror attack in 2001, a Marine division in the initial attack, and subsequently stability operations in Iraq in 2003. It led all U.S. Marine forces in the Middle East as commander, one Marine Expeditionary Force, and U.S. Marine Forces Central Command. These are just a few of his many accolades. We'll let him share more of his story during tonight's discussion. Please help me welcome General James Mattis to the stage. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. I'd also like to welcome our moderator for the evening, Ronan O'Malley, Programs Director for the Council, to the stage as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you again. What a great thanks to Wells Fargo and Ashley and BP, and especially to Combined Arms and the Lone Survivor Foundation. They do incredible work, and if you're interested in supporting them or perhaps working with them, they will have people outside of the lobby afterwards who can take questions. They also have some information for you. So thank you again to both of them. And I just want to say to General Mattis, it is truly an honor to have you here. I'm truly honored. In my many years at the council, this is an absolute highlight. So thank you very much for joining us at the council. And this book, just for people who haven't had a chance to read it yet, it's excellent. I enjoyed it. I read it twice. Can you tell us about what it was? What was your kind of motivation for writing this, and more importantly, maybe what you hope people get out of your book?
Yeah, well, the motivation is, ladies and gentlemen, when you get the color hair that I have now, you want to pass on the lessons you learned. You want to tell the young folks, here's what I did right, here's what I did wrong, and now hopefully you can go out and make your own mistakes, not the same ones I made. But some of the fundamental messages in it are that you've got to build trust in any organization you're going to lead. You're called a leader by your troops. You can't declare yourself a leader. You say you're the commanding general, you can say you're a sergeant, say you're a colonel, but only your troops can declare if you're a leader. And the way you get to be a leader is you build harmony and you build trust. Trust is the coin of the realm. So what I tried to do was always make very, very clear what it is I wanted to accomplish, and I'd get it out and I'd make sure everybody understood, from my 40-man platoon at one point to 23,000 sailors and Marines of a division at another different point. And once I was convinced they knew what I wanted to do, I tried to just take my hands off the steering wheel, go out, circle around, check them out a lot, talk with them, hear how it's going, but let them make decisions and delegate the decision authority down as low as was competent to carry it out. So that's a big message there. There's too many places now that do what we call command and control. I didn't believe in control. I wanted command and feedback. Let the young guys get out there, have them feed back to you what's going on and adjust, but leave them the freedom to use their initiative and aggressiveness. The other big message is allies. I would tell you, ladies and gentlemen, I had the privilege to fight many times for our country, and not one time was I in an all-American formation. I was always with other allies alongside me, and my view of that is that nations that have allies, that build trust with allies, they thrive. And the nations that don't have allies, that humiliate them, try to dominate them, scorn them, they die. It's that simple. So I always tried to build up organizations where allies were welcome. I didn't look at what their troops could not do. I looked at what their troops could do and employed them accordingly. And it was a great team. When you get out there like that, the Americans aren't carrying the full load, and you're getting another vote in the United Nations, you're getting another vote in NATO. It's the right way to go when you're alongside allies out there. So allies, take your hands off the steering wheel and give delegated authority down and build trust. And that's what I try to bring out in the book.
And just in case people are wondering, the core of this book, you started 5-6 years ago. You do talk a bit about your time as Secretary of Defense, but the heart of this book is what you've learned about leadership in your incredible career as a Marine. Yeah. So just so people maybe will understand, you also think it's probably not appropriate to talk too much about a sitting president, whether a Democrat or Republican.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm in Texas, and I'm here with mixed emotions. I'm in Texas, and my mixed emotions are I'm so happy I could cry. I'm from the West, the Northwest, and out West we ride for the brand. It's that simple. I rode for the U.S. Constitution. I'd had the book done before I went into this job, but as soon as I got the phone call asking if I'd come to Washington to be interviewed, at that point, the book could not go forward under federal law or federal ethics rules. So it just sat there until I got out of the office, and then basically I put it out. But I did not write about my time in the office. I made clear why I was leaving the job. It was the best job in the world to serve along our young men and women who sign up, who look past all the hot political rhetoric in this country and say, I'm going to serve. And the last thing I'm going to do when I get out is start writing about it right away. When I got tens of thousands of troops in the Hindu Kush or at sea in the Persian Gulf right now, they don't need a former Secretary of Defense now starting to talk over here. You see what I'm driving at? I ride for the brand, and I stick with the brand even after I get out. That oath still means something. So.
And General, just to give a bit of context to this evening, the discussion we'll have, if you notice there are one or two particular topics that we don't discuss, it's not because we're not cognizant of it. It's that there's some topics that are so fluid and so dynamic and perhaps evolving right now, some hot spots in the world, that perhaps it's not appropriate or advisable to talk about it, correct?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, maybe could you just talk about to go way back to being a young kid in Washington, someone who started hitchhiking at age 13. How is it that you became a Marine, and why you chose the Marines?
Yeah, it wasn't a real deep thought, to tell you the truth. I was in my first year at college, and I didn't realize you had to go to class and get grades to keep your draft deferment. I thought you just paid the money and you got the draft deferment. I was having a good time in college until it became clear with my draft number and my rather lackadaisical attitude toward college that I was going to get drafted. And in our day, you had to go. I mean, there was no You could go to Canada, but we didn't think they'd be brought back a few years later as heroes. We thought we'd never be able to come back for our parents' anniversary or brother's wedding or something. So went down. My brother was in Vietnam in the Marines right then, and kind of in my neighborhood, guys joined the Marines. There was not a whole lot more thought to it.
And can you talk about, your book does an incredible job, I know you're all going to enjoy it, about all the different people you learn from and processes and experiences you learn from, but maybe some of your earliest experiences as a young officer in the Marines in a difficult time, the early 70s and through the mid-70s. What did you learn from the Vietnam veterans, officers who are coming back?
Thanks, Ronan. The Vietnam veterans, I am not a Vietnam veteran, but the Vietnam veterans raised me in the Marine Corps, and they taught me kind of I was an infantry officer, you know, infant soldier, young soldier, that's how they got their name. And these are the guys who go toe-to-toe with the enemy. It's where we've taken 85% of our nation's casualties since 1945, by the way. So these were the guys who brought me up. We didn't have many sergeants and senior NCOs right after Vietnam. The war had been quite damaging to the health of the U.S. military. My first platoon sergeant, this is the senior Marine I was a second lieutenant. You have a senior enlisted Marine, platoon sergeant. First one was Corporal Wayne Johnson, 21 years old. I was 21 years old. And he taught me, he was, by the way, an immigrant from British East Indies with a name like Wayne Johnson. You know what we all called him, John Wayne, of course, right away. And what he taught me was it's important, it's just as important what you put in your orders as what you leave out and leave to the NCOs. Just leave a lot of flexibility for the NCOs. My next platoon sergeant was Corporal Manuel Rivera. He was a Mexican immigrant on a green card who joined the Marines. And what he taught me was that at times it's better just to look at somebody and say nothing than open your mouth and make them feel humiliated as a man. Leave their manhood standing and don't go after them. Don't take 10 pounds out of them. My next platoon sergeant, I was very proud of this, was a staff sergeant. And he was Remy Lebrun from Quebec, also a green card holder. I bring this up because immigrant kids and immigrant families serve at a much higher rate in our military than do native-born. And I learned that in my first 2 years as an infantry lieutenant. So it was a real eye-opener, and what he taught me was basically that when you go into a fight, make sure your troops know what you want to do, and then leave it to them completely. Now, I learned and also add to that, he would take me out and say, watch what's going on over here. And there was the old staff sergeant, the senior guy who'd been there and done that and got 10 T-shirts to prove it. And he's just taking me along and showing me what's happening day by day.
And I don't want to take away from the book because I know you're all going to enjoy reading it. And I know more than anyone, you implore people to read. You feel it's vital. Yeah. But maybe briefly we could talk through a few of the core concepts of what you see as vital to leadership. Maybe you could talk about your 3 C's.
Well, the 3 C's, you know, you got to be careful about making checklists. But one point I would make is you got to care about your troops. You've got to care about them because they're literally going to put their lives on the line. And when you point to them and then point forward, that's when they're going to really do it in the infantry. That's when the veneer of civilization is gone and you're going into the fight. So you can't let your passion for excellence, and we all want to be in excellent units. We want to be in excellent companies. We want our football team to be excellent. Whatever it is, but don't let your passion for excellence wipe out your compassion for them as human beings. Keep your respect for people. No one's laying awake at night trying to figure out how to mess things up. They make mistakes. And the most important thing there is make sure you know the difference between a bona fide mistake and a lack of discipline. Now, we used to say the Marines are part of the Naval Service. We used to say in the Naval Service, you run the ship on the rocks, and you're going to stand tall for it. You're going to be held responsible. But if it's just a mistake someone made, then the coach, the lieutenant, the sergeant, they need to look at how they can coach better. Because nobody was trying to do that, you know, so just be a better coach. The next thing is conviction. You've got to have conviction. If you don't believe in what you're doing, when you're in a position where you're going to put young people's lives, young men's lives on the line, then they're not going to feel confident in going in. They just won't do it. And the last thing, of course, is competence. if you don't know how to call artillery fire close, if you don't know how to get a medevac helicopter in, then in that line of work, you're risking people's lives. You actually have a moral component to what you're doing. And I think that it's really important as you do this as a young officer, you be physically as tough as your toughest guys. Many times I would find discipline problems in units, and I'd find maybe some of the officers were not putting them through the same rigors that some of their troops were going through. And that's where you'd find DUIs or drug use, sexual harassment, lack of fire discipline in a firefight. If they were tough officers, they were not sleeping in their sleeping bag at night, they were out checking the troops, they were a lot more effective. So that's how you put the 3 C's of, caring and conviction and competence together and kind of glue it all together into a package.
And then you can talk about, in the book you mentioned, the only war an officer needs to win, you can finish that.
Yeah, that's a good point, because officers don't win battles, okay? They can set the strategy, they can do that sort of thing, but officers only have to win one battle, and that's the one they have to win every day, and that's for the hearts and trust of their troops. At that point, the troops do all the winning of fights. I get a lot of credit. I mean, I'm touched, I'm humbled that you would all stand and clap when I walk in, but ladies and gentlemen, this is no false modesty, hear what I say, I get a lot of credit for the blood, sweat, and tears of the young troops and the families that lost their boys. So just keep that in mind, because this is reality.
And maybe just a lot of people, especially your fellow Marines, know it. They know Callsign chaos. You mentioned, obviously, you have no problem causing chaos in enemy's ranks, but can you talk about the real origin of your call sign?
Yeah, the real origins of my call sign chaos. Like many good ideas that come out, new ideas that come out of California, a little tongue-in-cheek, you know what I mean? And so I'm in the Mojave Desert with about 7,000 sailors and Marines, and if you don't wear them out every week, out in the desert, humping up and down big mountains and shooting up the desert, then they'll start scrambling around and wrestling with each other and beating each other up just for the fun of it, So we used to wear them out there, and I had great ideas. I mean, I was brilliant. I'd go down and I'd see my operations officer, and he was a rather laconic fellow out of Brooklyn. By the way, he married a girl from South Texas, and when they got in arguments, they couldn't understand each other between the Brooklyn and Texans, So I go down with another great idea one day to my Brooklyn-born operations officer, and I just know this is the best idea he's ever heard. And as I'm walking out, I see chaos written on the whiteboard. I say, "What's this about?" And he said, "Oh, don't worry about that." So, right, "Oh, no. And what's this about?" And I waterboarded him. I got it out of him, and it was, "Colonel has another outstanding solution," and it was very tongue-in-cheek, So I adopted my irreverent troops' view of me as my call sign.
But perhaps it is reflective of you being always willing to think outside the box and always do something kind of different, you think?
I think it was just indicative that I needed to be humble once in a while, so I'd remember that when people called chaos on the radio, I'd remember, now think before you talk here,
So maybe we'll kind of briefly go through you have a massive number of highlights from your military and combat career, but to touch upon a few of them, maybe we'll just start with Desert Storm, 1991. Leading troops into Kuwait, the liberation of Kuwait. Can you tell us what you learned from that, your first time being in combat? And then also you discuss it in the book with the ambush that you guys went through, but then how you got out of it.
Yeah, so we'd been fighting for about 3 days, and I hadn't slept much. That's normal in those situations. It had been continuous fighting. We'd been an assault battalion that had to open the path through the minefields for the troops who would follow. About 1,300 sailors, Marines, and Kuwaiti Arabs who were joined to us. And so we did that, and then we fought for more days as it went on and on, fighting under the oil smoke and all that stuff. And so at one point, we had to skirt around a quarried area, and I had helicopters fly over it, and they say, "No, nothing down there." And as we went around it, We came back out. I didn't notice the power line. I was just dead tired. And as soon as my front elements hit the power line, the whole horizon opens up and the enemy's firing at us across the desert. And I should have picked it up right away. I walked them right into it. And just then we saw red star clusters fired up by our logistics troops in the rear with the refuelers and the ammo, the battalion aid station, the doctors and everything, that somebody, how we had passed, had guys in the quarried area. So now I got my mortar guys, for example, getting out and setting up 4 mortars pointing south and 4 mortars pointing north. At that point, you're not the most brilliant tactician in the world, you know? Somehow you've managed to get your battalion surrounded in the open desert. That's almost impossible. But as usual, my lads got me out of it, and some of them joked with me later saying, "You were just testing us right there, Colonel. You want to see if we still had it?" I said, "Oh yeah, right, you know." So that afternoon we got called over to the regimental CP, the commanders of the 4 assault battalions, and it turned out they were murdering innocent people in the streets of Kuwait City. And they said, "It's late in the day, but you got to break through to the city. You got to stop it." So we got our orders, you know, what would be the attack formation, everything. I turned to leave, and the colonel let everybody else walk away. He said, "Hey, Jim, come over here." He said, "You learned something today?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Okay, go back to work." He didn't make a big deal of it. He didn't pontificate. He didn't decide he had to reiterate what I'd learned the hard way. He just said, "Okay, go back to work." And that makes a world of difference right then when the person, you know, you're obviously not going to talk to your troops about it in detail. And the one guy who knew exactly what happened, he was able to watch it with binoculars, kept confidence in you. It reminded me, you got to, when the chips are down, that's not the time to kick somebody. You know, that's the time you boost them back up, you coach them, get them back in the fight.
And I think it also exemplifies the fact you're, you know, very, very intense with regards to training for months and months before all of this. But you mentioned the book, the idea of muscle memory kicking in, and that these guys from a logistics trained, cooks, engineers, drivers, they fought very admirably and were well trained, obviously.
Well, in the Marines, every Marine's a rifleman, so even, you know, even if they refuel vehicles or they're cooks and they're stretcher bearers in combat or something, they're all riflemen, so they took care of it back in the rear until the infantry got back, and the infantry guys came back laughing and said everybody is dead back there. They didn't have to do anything.
And just kind of maybe one of the highlights of leadership from you know, Desert Storm, obviously Colin Powell, someone you know well, but in the book you're pretty frank about your discussions of Republican presidents and Democratic presidents. But maybe could you talk about George H.W., George Bush, the father, senior, and what you call his trifecta of leadership?
Well, what he would do is he would, number one, work with the Allies. I think by the time we were done, he was done putting together the coalition, either the troops on the ground or the people who were providing money to really help fund it, so it wasn't all coming out of our taxpayers. By the time he got done, I think only Cuba and Yemen seemed to be outside the coalition. You know, like everybody was helping us. And then the second thing was that he basically he set a limit to what we were going to do. He said, it's a limited war. We are going to free the people of Kuwait. That's all we're going to do. And then when we did it very quickly, some people from one of the political wings said, well, let's march on Baghdad. He said, no, no, no. That'll shatter the whole coalition. We signed up for one thing. We all stick together. We free the people of Kuwait who are being brutalized by Saddam's troops. And then we stop at that point. Besides, Saddam Hussein may not be a nice guy, but he's the biggest block to Iran in the Middle East. So we leave him there to do that, and we don't have to do it. And the third thing was he basically brought in enough troops. For example, when after the elections, he waited till the midterm elections were over, and they said, okay, now we're going to throw them out of Kuwait. We blocked them for 6 months. And at that point, or blocked them for 3 months, he said, how many troops do you need? And the generals said, well, we probably need around 300,000 troops for about 3-4 months. He said, no, take 400,000 troops. I want it done fast. He didn't put these troop caps on, see what I mean? So he limited the political end state. He got the 100 and some odd countries into the coalition, Then he gave us enough to get the job done and get it done quickly, so we didn't get drawn into some long, drawn-out, inconclusive war. It just ground on, and then we came home.
And do you think the fact that he's the last American president with combat experience is part of the reason why he's such a capable military leader?
Well, combat experience doesn't make a great leader. It can contribute. We're all formed by our formative experiences, and certainly his informed him as the youngest, I think, or second youngest Navy pilot in World War II. But I think, too, that a guy like Abraham Lincoln led, very well in our Civil War. And as you look, especially at the end of the war, when he talks about with malice for none, with charity for all, we're going to bind the nation back together. You see a guy with no military experience, but he knows how to pick generals, and he knows how to bring us together as Americans, so there's no more of this contempt or disrespect. And it was a great loss that he was assassinated, but it shows that you don't have to be a combat veteran to be a good leader, too.
And then more recent times, can you talk about, again, kind of thinking outside of the box, strategizing and, across the military services, forming basically what became the longest amphibious assault, over 400 miles into Kandahar, and basically putting a second flank, a second front for the Taliban. You talk about that experience.
Yeah, well, let me tell you two things. If you're going to fight, it's great to have a wonderful commander above you. And secondly, if you're going to fight, it's great to fight enemy generals dumber than a bucket of rocks. You know what I mean? The admiral, right after 9/11, I was sent over to the Middle East for a little while to do an exercise to show that these maniacs who thought by killing some of us and innocent people from 91 countries, that's how many countries lost innocent people on 9/11 in New York City and Washington. They thought they could scare us, and so we went over on an exercise show. We don't scare. We're the Americans. We don't scare. So while there, I was slipped over into Bahrain, and the admiral calls me in. I'm a 1-star. He's a 3-star. He'd done his homework, and he said, this is a crazy doggone admiral, I'll tell you. If it'd been 150 years ago, he'd have an eye patch, he'd have a sword, and he'd have a Jolly Roger at the masthead, But he calls me in, ladies and gentlemen, and he says, look, the CIA guys and the Green Berets, they're pushing hard against up north at Mazar-i-Sharif. They're going to fall back, the enemy, force back on Kabul. He'd done his homework, and he said, no one's ever held Kabul in 500 years. It always falls. So they'll fall back on Kandahar in the south. He said, can you get the Marines together from the Atlantic or the Mediterranean Fleet and the Pacific Fleet and go 400 miles inland and go after Kandahar? I said, yes, sir, I can do it. He said, okay, go write the orders, so whatever I got to send to Washington and go look at it. So I went up in an airplane and I circled around, and I could see exactly how it could happen. Because of all the reading I'd done, required to do by the Marine Corps, by the way, at each rank, they give you a new reading list. I could see exactly as clearly as I can see you how we could stick a knife in their back. I didn't care how brave they were, how many guns they had, or anything else. So I went back, we wrote the storyboard up for how we would do it. And then thanks to some great diplomats who got us clearance to fly over Pakistan and the great U.S. Navy to bring us into the coastline there, we were able to launch in heavy helicopters that were air refuelable, bring in tankers, and we were on our way. It wasn't that difficult, frankly, with the kind of training and the kind of equipment we had, but we were the only country in the world that could have done something like that. It was nothing unique, thinking outside the box for. I mean, generally we don't go that far inland, but I've always thought that, doctrine is good. You should always know it. But doctrine can also be the last refuge of the unimaginative, if you know what I mean. You kind of hide in it. So I just thought we'd go get the guy who attacked America. It was personal, And
in Afghanistan, perhaps maybe some of your first struggles with dealing with policymakers above you, kind of challenging decisions that maybe commanders on the ground had a better understanding of. Maybe, obviously, the book discusses being held back with regards to assaulting Kandahar, but maybe to move on to something that more people might be familiar with was Tora Bora and the presumption where Osama bin Laden's hiding, and what happened with you and your men.
Yeah, you see what happened, ladies and gentlemen, I was under Navy command and control, and Navy is very loose command and control, okay? They basically leave to the captain of the ship or the commander of the task force. I commanded the ships and the sailors and the Marines and the ones ashore for about, I don't know, the first week or two. And then I stayed in command of the ships under the Navy, but I came under Army command for the troops ashore. And our services are all different, you know, and that's I think that's a good thing. But the Army is much more staff-oriented, policy or written papers, what we call PowerPoint, which I don't have much regard for. I think it makes us stupid. But basically, I liked it for a little while when the Army took over, because they'd send me these thick PowerPoint things that would come off the printer. And you know how they're warm when they come off the printer? Yep, you guessed it. I'd put it on my chair so I could warm my bottom. Because it was so cold there as the middle of winter. So I found a use for it. But what I didn't do, we were getting intel that we knew where Osama bin Laden was. And in the intel, I thought it was so clear, and I'd studied the Army campaign down here along your border against Geronimo, and the way he put in those heliograph stations along the border so they could track them. And so we figured out with computers where we could put Marines along the border in the high ground so they could see each other and block those two valleys where Osama bin Laden was. And I'm spending all my time getting cold weather gear, because we're going to be up at 14,000, 15,000 feet, making certain I've got all the troops ready, the helicopter being worked on so they can be ready to go with all the birds up and ready to fly. I forgot to get used to telling my commander, my new Army commander, what I was doing. And we never got the order to go in and close the valley off, 2 valleys off, and then push everybody up the valley and get them. And so I learned that you cannot just focus as a leader down. You got to be focused up and down, and you got to make sure you're spending time enabling your troops to be unleashed. And that's where I think I fell short.
And moving on to the next big theater, obviously, is Iraq. In the book, you talk about. Can you explain? You say in the book, Saddam was contained. The decision to invade Iraq, you have no say in the matter, but it stunned you. Can you talk about why it stunned you? Why the decision to invade Iraq stunned you?
Well, I'd fought the Iraqi army 10 years before, and we had airplanes on operation. The U.S. Air Force on Northern Watch and Southern Watch was keeping an eye on Saddam. So I was brought out of Afghanistan and told I'd be promoted and take command of the 1st Marine Division, about 23,000 guys, sailors and Marines, and get them ready to go. And I was stunned at saying, why are we doing that? And there was some impression by some that he was somehow connected to 9/11. And when I'd served in the Middle East since 1979, anyone who knows the differences between the Sunni and Shia zealots, they would not work together. So I knew that wasn't the case. But that's why they're called orders, ladies and gentlemen, and not likes. You don't have to like it. They're orders. And when the civilian control the military, when they make a decision about what you're going to do, then you're duty bound to uphold the Constitution and obey the civilian leadership. That is the way it is. And you don't go in and say, well, I'm going to be 90% on this. You're either 100%, what I call totus porcus. That's Latin for whole hog, okay? But you're either all in, loyalty only counts when there's 100 reasons not to be, as far as I'm concerned. So now we're going to go in, we're going to do it as best we can, and that's what we did.
And can you talk about yourself and many of your comrades being on the ground and the kind of realization that there's a great plan and strategy to topple Saddam and the Iraqi army, but what happens afterwards? Can you talk about those challenges and the fact that you as a battalion commander and others like you had to become what you call a de facto mayor of wherever you were stationed?
Yeah, I mean, it fell to us in the military, although we'd been told we would be withdrawn almost immediately from Iraq, that we would be withdrawn and it would be turned over to somebody. I'm not quite sure who, because we had not planned the way the U.S. Army planned, for example, the takeover of Germany in 1945. They'd started planning in 1943 for what they would do. We had not done that, And that was a military, certainly a military oversight to a degree. Technically, it was supposed to go to State Department, but it was never sorted out. And this shows what happens when you don't have a good policy and a good strategy. So it fell to our soldiers, the British soldiers, the U.S. Marines, that they had to then become the de facto mayors of town. Now, they're good infantrymen. They are real good at infantry and that sort of thing. And they adapted very quickly. What I did was, in order to, we had a plan, because the Vietnam generation of generals just above me recognized the frailty of what we were doing, and they'd actually written kind of standby plans, which I had with me. And they helped, get the Army back into the barracks, pay them a little bit to feed their families, don't let them be out there on their own. So we're getting them back in the barracks, work with the locals, get the water going again, get the electricity flowing again. We're doing all this, but I wanted something that did more than told them technical or tactical things, So I went back to an old book and I saw things like first do no harm, from the physician's oath. So how do you do this? How do you fight an enemy, for example, that's now starting to hide among the people? And so I'd tell them, first do no harm. If in order to kill a terrorist, you got to shoot across a crowded marketplace, do not take the shot and take a chance of hitting a woman or child. Hunt him down another day and kill him, but don't take a chance. Then I had another one, no better friend, no worse enemy. I stole that one off a dead Roman general, from long ago. I get all my good ideas from old books, And so I would try to guide the hearts and the minds of the Marines as they tried to carry out this very difficult job. And then I'd read a lot about how other people had done it, that sort of thing. But we could have done a lot better than that, Lady Joe. And then when we disbanded the Army, now we had a real problem on our hands. That was a decision made well above my level. But you can imagine what their Army thought when we started getting them back in the barracks. We were starting to work together. They'd gotten over the humiliation of defeat because we didn't treat them in a triumphant way. We treated them as if you made the right call not to fight for Saddam Hussein. And then when we disbanded them, that was a very, very unfortunate decision.
And do you think, obviously with the new huge focus going to Iraq, and obviously the hundreds of thousands more troops that would be required to go into Iraq, that it hurt our chances of kind of long-term stabilization in Afghanistan?
Well, they took our eye off the ball in Afghanistan. NATO was pouring troops in there because, again, they knew that we'd been attacked, and NATO had been set up for us to come aid them if the Russian army attacked them. And here they were, the first time they ever went to war was when America was attacked, and now they have troops on the ground there. Not just NATO, but NATO drew other people in too. Jordan, Turkey, Turkey is NATO, Canada, Germany, Norway, United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand. They were all there with us. And they could have said, well, you got attacked, but I don't think I really want to be with you because that might mean the terrorists will attack me. That's not what they did. They all said, you were attacked, we were attacked, we're going in with you. And that's when you need allies. You need every one of those allies. So we had those troops going into Afghanistan, but we began pulling our troops out to go into the Iraq campaign. And by the time we were stretched too thin, we'd lost a lot of focus, and now neither of those wars was going well, and we were really wearing out the troops.
And just not too long after you came back from that deployment, you got involved more on the strategy and policy side of things. Maybe you can talk about two things: your idea of the development of campaign design, and then also what you learned as one of the commanders within NATO.
Let me touch on two things before we go there, Ronan. I noticed a lot of veterans in the room before when you were asked. One night, I just want to say thank you to all of you. And I know I met a World War II veteran earlier, Korean War veteran, Vietnam veterans, and all. Generals can do a lot, but they cannot do the same thing as what your experience and your example set for us. And one night we were in Iraq, getting ready to attack a town called Fallujah. About midnight, I was down talking to the 2 assault battalions, time for generals to get out of the way and leave it to the young guys. And as I was falling back, we were behind an assault company that would actually go in early before dawn to get the enemy's snipers out of the way so the battalion could move into the city. And the enemy made some mischief nearby, so I got down with my half-dozen radio operators as we were walking back to our vehicles and checked in with the corporal there. He said, we'll take care of it. So they took care of the problem, fired them up, got them to run away and all that. So we all lay in there for a little bit, and one of the Marines, thinking we'd moved on, he said to the corporal, he said, hey, Corporal, do you think, and I mean, they're watching the hours go down until they attack. They're just stripped down in a very cold night waiting to go. He said, do you think Fallujah is going to be real tough in the morning? And we've got ladies here, so I'm not going to put it in quite the words of the corporal back to his young private there. But he said, basically, hush and get some sleep. We took Iwo Jima. Fallujah won't be nothing. Now, you stop and think of that. That young corporal wasn't even born within a couple of decades of Iwo Jima. But that example from the veterans, every one of you is a veteran. Those examples come down and remind them, there's nothing worse than Iwo Jima. There's nothing worse than Shiloh. Don't worry about it. You're going to be okay. That's worth more than all the speeches any general could give. And I think it's really important you remember what a precious commodity our veterans are in terms of what service they've provided the country. And there I was down there listening to it, hardened a young man who's going into his first firefight within hours that, hey, he'd be okay. Anyway, go ahead.
And maybe and related to that, I think right now less than 1% of the United States has served in the military since 9/11. I think it's roughly about 3 million people. 1% basically protecting 99%. Another great Marine and combat journalist, C.J. Chivers, who we've hosted before, he creates a great line he saw somewhere in Iraq, on a wall. It said, America is not at war. The Marine Corps is at war. America is at the mall. Can you talk about this idea, and I think it's probably a pretty serious one, the idea that the general American populace is detached from the realities and the difficulties of what sacrifice required for war?
To a degree, I think we all want that, don't we? We don't want people to lose their freedom. We don't want the children in school to be wrestling with war, and that sort of thing as they're still trying to form their lives, their brains, their spirits. So to a degree, we could be very happy, I think, that war is not penetrated to the heartland except in some very few cases, terrorist cases. But generally, we've been able to keep the enemy at some distance. But there is a concern we have back when the draft was stopped that it was going to be good for the military in the short run. You'd have all volunteers. That's a good thing, to have people there who want to be there, especially when they're putting their lives on the line. But this is the first time we fought a war, Civil War, Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam. Those were all fought with people being drafted. Everybody felt they had skin in the game. And for the ones I worry most about this alienation are not the veterans. Most of us come home, I think, and are just so happy to be back among you that it's wonderful. But the Gold Star families, the ones who have lost their sons and daughters, the ones who've lost their husband, the widow, and she's all of 22 years old with a little one, I worry that they feel awfully lonely, that they're not really, really understood. People don't know quite what to say to her. They don't know what to say to the mom and dad who are, at the Christmas service at the church this year, knowing that last year their son was there. I think that's the tough part. And this is all part, to me, of somewhat of an alienation in our society. It's not unique to us alone. A lot of young people nowadays whose lives seem pretty friendless. I worry about that alienation. But I don't think it's something that really undercuts the heart and soul of America that so few people serve. I think we ought to have some kind of public service, whether you teach in an inner city school, maybe volunteers in service to America, you go off and go into Peace Corps, Marine Corps, I don't care what it is. I live where there's a lot of Mormons. And they just take it as normal that they're boys and now they're girls, do 2 years of something for something bigger than themselves. And that's what worries me. It's not the military service so much. It's the service. The country's like a bank. You got to put something into it if you want to take something out of it. It's just normal, And I don't think we have that expectation, and that does worry me.
And maybe just kind of looking at the bigger, broader global picture. You're a lifelong student of history. You'll appreciate his list of recommended books at the back of this, great list. Perhaps one of the hardest things is to realize maybe when you're in the midst of a transition, maybe you're in the midst of a movement within history. The 1990s, the fall of communism.
Yeah.
We thought, this is opening up a liberal democracies. Can you talk about your content where you're talking about the idea that democracy is an experiment? We need to protect it, and the U.S. needs to lead.
You get to travel around a lot with the military, and a lot of times you're in countries where they're not as well off as us. I don't mean just financially. I mean they don't have the freedom. They fear the policeman on the block, and we don't really fear the policeman no matter what you see on the news. Somebody who, hears the glass break in their window at 2 o'clock in the morning, they're going to grab that phone and call 911 right away, and we know it. This is really a very fortunate country the way we're put together. But you see people who aren't as well off, and you realize that what we're doing here is we're still building the country. It's noble work, but it's hard work. The Constitution was designed to be hard. And so it's all just a great big experiment to see if a government of the people, by the people, for the people can survive. And if you can't compromise, for example, when our founding fathers put 3 co-equal branches of government together, and you can't govern. Now, I understand when you have an election, you have some pretty strong disagreements, and you're having some pretty strong arguments, not always civil. I'm smart. Ronan, you're not.
It's okay. I was smart enough to get you here, so that's about it. Yeah.
Okay. You say you're right. You say I'm wrong. Okay, I got it. Little rough at times. That's democracy. But when the election's over, we got to roll up our sleeves and work together. We got to be friends to one another, and we've got to make it work. There's no way around it because compromise is required to make a democracy work. And yet we seem to have lost some of that. And that worries me as we fight to protect this experiment and keep it alive, that we all get back to feeling respect for one another. And if we've got different views, then let's be hard on the issue. And let's not be hard on each other. No, that's not needed.
Maybe the bit of time we have left, I might get into a few topics briefly because we're limited on time of regards to foreign policy, and then some questions that were sent into us by some of our members and veterans as well. But maybe just in a kind of a broader sense, like you mentioned, since I think you said 1979, you've spent a large part of your career both in the military and then in as a Secretary of Defense, either in or focused upon the Middle East. Mm-hmm. I think for the American public, mentioned in your book, we've had troops in Western Europe since 1945. We'd have troops in South Korea and Japan. South Korea since the end of the war, and Japan since the end of World War II as well, and Korea then at the war. Is that perhaps maybe easier for the American public to understand that was for an existential threat? That is for the incredible threat of communism. But perhaps the jihadist threat, unless they get weapons of mass destruction, was obviously a big fear, is harder to get people to realize why is it important to draw the line in Syria? Why is it important to draw the line and try and maintain stability in Afghanistan? Yeah. How would you describe that to the kind of general American public of why we need to stand in places like that?
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I've dealt with these guys since 1979 in the Middle East, and they did not arrive at their position rationally and logically, so you're not going to rationally and logically talk them out of it. With economic packages, with teaching, education, jobs, we may be able to go after the root causes with younger people, but once the minds are polluted, once these maniacs really believe in what they're saying, that girls don't go to school, their property, that when they say you got to pray a certain way, everyone has to do it this way. Remember, they've killed more Muslims than they've killed Christians and Jews and Hindus combined. And these guys are real nutcases. So terrorism is going to be an ambient threat. Now, I understand people get elected, they want good health care, they want good education, but remember what it was like the day after 9/11 with not an airplane in the sky over our country? Do we really have to learn this lesson again? Because you can want a war over, you can even declare a war over and bring our troops back from Iraq. And the CIA said, if you do that, you'll have to go back in a couple years. And the CIA was right. ISIS was no intelligence failure. And when you think of the millions of people made refugees by ISIS, and you think of the hundreds of thousands dead and wounded, when you think of the tens of thousands of young girls who've been enslaved, this is a result of a strategic decision. You know, George Shultz, our Secretary of State, in 1984 gave a speech in New York City, and he said, terrorism is going to happen, and he said it's going to kill innocent Americans, we're going to lose our troops in it, and we're going to have to fight this. 1984, 17 years before 9/11, he could see what was coming. One of the greatest generation, a reminder that they brought a certain wisdom about the world. So we're going to have to deal with this threat. I would call it an ambient threat, just like the oxygen in this room. It's going to be present. Now, the way we want to work it is what Condoleezza Rice says is by, with, and through your allies. By, with, and through. Not slamming them, not humiliating them, not telling them they're not doing enough, but coaching them, bringing them. I'll give you an example. For 3 administrations in France, 3 different administrations have kept the fight going against Boko Haram in the Lake Chad, Southern Sahara region. We provide about 3,000 troops, somewhere around that, to support about 10,000 of the French elite troops, the French Foreign Legion, French paratroopers, French Marines. Together, those 13,000 troops then bring the African troops to bear, teaching them, coaching them, arming them, giving them radios, advisors in the field. So when they are going after Boko Haram, they look over and they see a couple of French troopers with them, or they see a couple of American Green Berets with them, and they kind of get their manhood up, and they feel we can do it. So there's a way where we don't carry the full burden, but we are going to have to deal with terrorism. It's a reality, and if we don't, if we just try to wish it away, I would just guarantee you, I've been around them long enough, I do not patronize them. When they say girls don't go to school, they mean it. That's the way it's going to be. And I've seen people sell out their countries before. I've never seen someone sell out their God, even if it's a perverted view. These guys scare the dickens out of my Muslim friends, and we have had a lot of troops die in this fight, but we can't just give it up. We can do a better job, like with the French, of getting others to carry the burden as well, not just us alone. But we're going to have to deal with it.
And along those lines, just in terms of perhaps where we should be looking, you mentioned your friend Major General Tulin, who says Islam is not what's blocking progress here. It's a culture that rejects American or Western precepts. And you also mentioned that a cultural change will take a generation. Is that what we need to be prepared for? That this is going to take a very long time?
Well, it is. The change is going to take a long time, but I think you have to wonder what would have happened if 18 years ago when we started in Afghanistan, if every year we had paid for one boy and one girl in every high school to come to America or United Kingdom or Canada for 1 year of exchange student. You know what I mean? What would have happened after 18 years of that many people seeing how men and women work together, live together in this country, in Canada and UK, Netherlands, Norway, wherever, somewhere where they could get a mental model of what is different, what works. And I think that may be just as important as fighting the terrorists, is using education to open minds, because it's really hard to close a mind once it's been opened. It's really difficult. It's not impossible if someone goes loopy, but it's pretty hard. So I'd use education a lot more.
And again, just to follow up on really a core theme of your book, the importance of allies, you note that if anyone wants to call it quote unquote an American empire, it's an empire of ideals and ideas. Can you talk more about that?
The best way I can talk about it is give you a story that you'll all understand. I was a 2-star in Western Iraq. This is when we went back in. Excuse me. When I went back in there because of the war wasn't going well, we were called back to the Fallujah, Ramadi, a very, very terrible area. I had 29 sailors and Marines around me all the time, drivers, gunners, communicators, aide de camp. And these guys were with me every day. And over 4 months, 17 of those 29 lads would be killed or wounded around me. And I'm a general. I'm not in the tough fighting. It's a lot tougher for the guys in the infantry units. So one time we go out in the Western Euphrates River Valley, and we're inside we get to a perimeter out there in the middle of nowhere. 1 second lieutenant, about 40 sailors and Marines, and they're sitting out there blocking a rat line. This is where the foreign fighters are coming into Syria, from Syria, to blow up bombs in Baghdad and all. They've got to block this line. They're going out every night. They're fighting every night, and they're all alone out there. So I go out and I talk to them when the sun comes up, and the lieutenant says, by the way, we caught a guy laying an IED, a mine, on the road you were coming in on last night. I said, well, that's kind of personal, And he said, well, he's lived 2 years in London, and he's lived in Switzerland, and he speaks perfect English. You want to talk to him? I said, sure. So they bring him over to see me, and it's not a good night for him. He was out there, digging his hole, had his wheelbarrow, had 2 artillery rounds, had a battery, car battery. He looks up, and there's 5 guys with automatic rifles standing around him. So he knew immediately his 401k was in jeopardy, okay? So he's sitting there, and I said, the Marines brought him over, and we're sitting on the ground, me and this Arab guy, and they cut the little handcuffs off and little plastic cuffs. And I said, what are you doing this for? You're Sunni, we're the Marines, we're the only friends you got in this country. What are you trying to kill us for? And he did start off on one of those rants. You Jews, you Americans, you're here to steal the oil. I said, no. I said, you're an educated man. Every time I go to the gas station, I pull my wallet out and buy my oil. I haven't stolen anybody's oil, okay? So why don't you just go away? I'm not going to listen to this ignorance. And he got up and then said, can I sit here for a minute? I said, okay. So he's sitting there, and after a little while, he said, I just don't like having foreign soldiers in my hometown. Well, I can understand. I can respect that. I wouldn't want foreign soldiers in Houston. You know what I mean? So I said, okay, and I asked him about his family, got him a cigarette when he asked for it and everything. And he had a wife and 2 daughters living down about 10 kilometers away. And so we talked for a while about his family and stuff, and then kind of talked out, and the Marine stepped forward to take him away, put the handcuffs back on him, and he says, I guess I'm going to jail now. I said, you're lucky you're not dead for this little stunt, but yeah, you're going to be wearing an orange jumpsuit in Abu Ghraib for a good long time. Now listen to this. He said, General, he said, do you think if I'm a model prisoner, I could immigrate to America one day? Now think about that. He's so angry, he's literally trying to kill us. But the power of inspiration of this country can reach halfway around the world to the Western Euphrates River Valley. And he'd be loving to sit right where you're sitting here tonight and have his 2 daughters going to university right here in Houston. He'd give his eye teeth for that. And on the days we're most dissatisfied with this country, I sometimes think of that guy and how envious he was of me, because he knew where I was going home to, and he knew what my brothers, sisters, Americans could do because they were here. And I just think it's really, really important we remember that sort of an attitude. That's the best way for us sometimes to look at ourselves is through the eyes of a foreigner and just think how doggone blessed we are to be here.
Maybe just kind of a last question, and then I'll kind of go to a few of the questions from the audience that people would send in. If I talk to a lot of people in the military who've come back, they're great groups, obviously like Combined Arms and Lone Survivors Foundation supporting the troops here. But you hear from a lot of them, they say one of the things that's difficult is, I joined the military to be part of something bigger than me. I joined the military to belong to something, to have a purpose. What advice would you give for the people coming back who maybe feel a bit, not necessarily rudderless, but it's a challenge to kind of come back to the civilian world, back to where things maybe aren't as vital, aren't as important, and you don't have that kind of group camaraderie?
Yeah. Well, I think there's plenty of opportunities not to lose sight of what I'd call the 3 words that need to guide anyone who wants a really fulfilling life, and that's put others first. It's very simple. Just when you get back, 1, make sure you're still working out every morning so you're not getting sloppy. Get up in the morning, do your push-ups. Don't get up and say, woe is me, and then figure some way in your job to bring some of those attributes of being on time, doing a good job. And then you got to have some part of your life where you're giving back to others. You can work at the local food bank. You can, help out in any number of places where there's people living on the margins who aren't as lucky as us. Just look at where you can do that, and right away your troubles get cut in half. When you see someone else who's really in trouble in one of these opioid addiction centers or something, or you're down there working with old folks who don't have anybody to come by and visit them because their family's all passed on, all of a sudden you realize you got a lot more to be thankful for than that you've just been taken for granted. So I'd put others first, make sure you get a job or go to school and work out. Keep the body strong, because there's no reason for a veteran to be out of shape unless they were badly wounded. And even then, I've seen veterans badly wounded are competing in the Paralympics, so they're not sucking their thumb. So I think it's most important that you just go out and you help other people. And at that point, you'll be doing fine. Man, are we lucky or not to live? Could you imagine given an option of living in Houston or being in some of those countries overseas? We know how lucky we are. So just take advantage of it. Probably not real deep philosophy, but I only got 3 years of college. That's the best I can do for you.
Maybe just turning to some questions from the audience, parallels to what we've spoken about in your books. Someone asked, what is the best strategy for regaining or resuming relationships with allies whom we've marginalized? Mm-hmm. How do you repair what seems like possibly permanently affected relationships?
Yeah. We all make mistakes at times, and democracies go through pretty raucous times, when things are going wrong, that sort of thing. But once you break trust with somebody, it is hard. So I look back to look at people, ones like Mandela, who had to repair a country. You look back at George Washington, who had to, we had a U.S. Army, a Continental Army, a Revolutionary Army before we had a country. And you look back at how people like that led. How did they take things like Abraham Lincoln, where we are literally killing ourselves at the industrial level to save this country and to free slaves, to get over our country's birth defect when we were born. And George Washington had a very methodical way of addressing that very point. And the way he led was he started by listening and learning what other people were really thinking. Not just listening long enough to contradict them and say, no, you're wrong, but really listening to them and learning and then helping them. And then he would lead them. So I think what we're going to have to do is go back to these countries that have always believed in us and for whatever reason have parted ways, so that we're so isolated that here a couple weeks ago when we asked other countries to help us protect freedom of shipping, something in the past would have had 2-3 dozen countries there with ships and airplanes immediately. And right now we're down to about 5. And those, they're not putting very much in. They're watching us very carefully. We've all been places where people don't trust us right now. And so we're going to have to go back to listening to them, all of them, learning from them, helping them, and then leading. The country with the most aircraft carriers doesn't have all the good ideas. And I used to tell that to my American officers because in the military, believe it or not, we actually have done okay below the political level. What do I mean by that? Right now, by Mexico's calculation, we have the best military-to-military relationship between us and Mexico in our history. It's very quiet. We keep it very low-key because it's politically perhaps not real acceptable right now, but we are working very quietly and closely together. With Sweden and Finland, two European countries have never been part of NATO because they had to deal with nearby Russia next door. And right now we have the best military-to-military relations we've ever had with those two countries. But military-to-military is not good enough. It's got to be diplomatic, political, economic. That's the important stuff. The military can help the others. It can't replace them. And so listen, learn, help, and then lead. And it's going to be a long battle. It's like in a marriage where things have gone wrong, and now you're trying to put it back together. And it starts with showing respect for your fellow man and woman. You cannot humiliate them publicly. I got over enjoying public humiliation by second grade, you know what I mean? And not fun. So get back to the respect.
And just for the sake of time, I know it's a very hard thing to be brief on, but I did have multiple people ask me, can you talk about the unique differences and challenges of threats from Russia and also from China?
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, when I got to the Pentagon, I asked for the strategy that they had. They did not have one. They had not had one in 10 years. So that's not about one administration doing right or wrong. That was two different administrations had not come up with a strategy. And think of how much had changed with China, with Russia. So I went home that night with a yellow pad of paper and started writing. I brought in the smartest guys I could find, and they took my general framing principles and they started putting pencil to paper. And then we went to Europe, NATO being number one among our allies. We also stopped by Japan and Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, all of those nations. We talked to all of them. And then I went up on Capitol Hill and I talked to the folks up there. And we got the congressional support, and we've had record-breaking budgets. The 2 years I was in office, voted overwhelmingly bipartisan, by the way, Republican and Democrat. Because politics stops at the water's edge, at least it should. And with Russia and China, you have two nations that right now want to have veto authority over other nations' political decisions, diplomatic decisions, economic and security decisions. China does it like the Qing dynasty of a couple thousand years ago. They want tribute nations that pay tribute to them. And they muscle their way around and shred trust in the South China Sea by militarizing islands that they promised President Obama in the Rose Garden publicly they would not militarize. That's one way. That's the way China is doing it. They're stealing intellectual property, that sort of thing. On the Spratly Islands, because I had denied them access to an American naval exercise that some 36 nations are engaged in, China wanted to be part of it. We'd invited them. They put the weapons on the Spratly Islands, and then I disinvited them. And when my counterpart asked about it, I said, your president came here and told President Obama he would not militarize those islands. Now, either your military is disobeying orders from your president, which worries me greatly if they're doing that, or your president wasn't telling the truth. Which is it? Well, he changed the subject. He said, well, those were defensive weapons. And I said, you're a general and I'm a general. Let's forget that we're both wearing suits right now. You're a general and I'm a general. I've been shot at by defensive weapons and offensive weapons. I don't know the difference, okay? So we're going to have to collaborate where we can. We're going to have to confront China where we must. It is a very powerful country. We were never part of their 100 years of humiliation that the other colonial powers forced on them. But we're going to have to sort out how two nuclear-armed superpowers are going to basically get along with each other. Or as I told my counterpart, we're going to be as stupid as the Europeans twice in the 20th century and we're going to set the world on fire. And we deserve, our people deserve better than that. So we need to have philosophical discussion. With Russia, you're just going to have to deal with Putin. Putin is out to break NATO. He will do anything to weaken NATO, and he is committed to this. He too wants a veto authority over other nations. He's invaded too Georgia and Ukraine, and he's mucked around in our elections. And so there, we're just going to have to wait out Putin. And the problem is, he is ruining Russia. Russia's economy is slowly going down. They will not be able to maintain their military. He's going to get more dangerous as he realizes he's getting weaker. For a short time, we've just got to keep NATO strong so he's checkmated. And with China, we're going to have to build some kind of alliances that tell China, you've got to start acting responsibly, because we don't want this to turn into a confrontation. We don't need this to go that way. But it's going to take allies, allies, and allies again, and we're not doing well right now making allies.
All right, thank you. And last, this maybe, sorry, go ahead if anyone wants to applaud. Thank you.
No.
But last, just a fun note from another veteran. I know you have a very tight schedule, and I know you've got a very early flight, but Crest Clippard says, "Sir, the Marines and the citizenry of Houston are incredibly excited and honored that you're visiting. In true Texas fashion, we have organized a tailgate party to create hype and celebrate your visit." So, say, I don't know that General Mattis, his security team probably may not be up for him going over there. I don't know if he has the time, but please, if you want to go, Crest has organized this tailgate party at Frank's backyard at 413 Travis. And a lot of people from Combined Arms. I think Lone Survivor Foundation will be there as well. And just in conclusion, just want to let you all know, General Mattis' excellent book. We have a copy for every one of you when you're leaving. We'll have them. My colleagues will be passing them out. So don't worry, that'll all be there for you. And maybe just for the sake of time and organization, if you don't mind, just we'll let General Mattis leave the stage first before people get up and leave. And then again, I just want to thank again Wells Fargo and BP for so kindly sponsoring us in this event. And again, to everyone at Combined Arms and Lone Survivor Foundation, you guys are doing great work. And please, if you have any questions or you'd like to support either of those organizations, Spike and John and their colleagues will be out in the back. They have information and just whatever you need, please talk to them in the back of the room. And will you please all join me and I want to say the true honor of my career here at the council and thanking General Mattis. Thank you.
Thanks, Roman. Pleasure doing that with you, Roman. You're doing it. Thank you. Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen.